In a series of videos which deal with data for policy, this one is focusing on the question why quantification matters in modern societies. And we currently have a couple of examples, for example, in the US federal statistics, but also others. I will come back to this in a moment. But the drawing that you see here stems from another time, namely some 200 years ago, and it has been drawn by Francesco Goya, the well-known Spanish artist. And it shows us what happens when rationality sleeps. And for me as a statistician, this is a good example for the responsibility we have to produce solid and trustworthy facts for the discourse in public societies. At the beginning of this year, the year 2026, we have seen a couple of news which make us quite concerned that the American statistical system, so the federal system of the United States, is breaking down. Why? Because very important facts and indicators are being threatened. And we have a kind of poison zone between legitimate policy actions and legal policy actions. And in this poison zone, statistics and facts play a good or a bad role for a solid and democratic procedure, democratic decision-making and public discourse. This is a report from the US American Statistical Association, which deals with the nation's data at a crossroads. And it gives a report about the things which have happened in the course of last year. And the report mentions 6 critical risk areas for federal statistics. Firstly, cuts to statistical programs. Second, delays or reductions in data products. 3, budget and staffing reductions. Undermining leadership and staff delays in appointment or unfilled leadership roles, and misuse of data for non-statistical purposes, other emerging threats. This is quite a large number of threats which are being monitored by my colleagues in the United States. Another example which is very actual is a kind of attack against the consumer price index in Argentina, which has led the Director General or the President of the Argentinian Statistical Office to resign. This is also a reason of concern for the international statistical community because it shows a kind of gap in the independence of this very important institution for the country Argentina. Another example is the existing information, which is, for example, the GDP, the gross domestic product, are also being criticized because they are used for things they haven't been constructed for. So the gross domestic product is mirroring the market activities of a country in one year. It does not reflect and mirror the welfare, the well-being in a country, the impacts of consumption and production on environment and these kind of things. So the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has said, we must place true value on the environment and go beyond GDP as to measure the progress and well-being of nations and the international community. The last example I would like to give, which also explains the relationship between numbers on one side and policy making on the other side, is the pandemic. In the pandemic, we have witnessed some kind of outsourcing from the political area to the technosphere, so to say. The decisions of politicians were delegated to a pretended neutrality of model-generated numbers. And this bears a risk, because then the products of statisticians and other scientists are seen as if they were the truth, but not mirroring the truth. So there is a missing distance, and this is a question of sociology and relationship between the users and the producers of statistics and facts. This leads to a new field, or relatively new field, associated to the statistical methodology, and also methodologies of data sciences or informatics, which is called the sociology of quantification. So it's really interesting that we have 3 books which have very similar names and titles, stemming from a long period of time. In 1987, we have had a book which is called The Politics of Numbers. 1998, the famous book of Alain de Roisière, The Politics of Large Numbers, and more recently, 2 years ago, The New Politics of Numbers. So almost the same titles, similar coverage of what is being dealt with in these books. All of them are treating the relationship between the production of facts, numbers, indicators, and their use, and the feedback loops between production and utilization. Most famous in this field is Alain de Roisière, a French statistician, who emphasized that quantification is not merely a technical process, but also a social phenomenon that influences how we perceive and organize our world and our nations and our policy making. It involves as well the production and the communication of numbers, and it translates qualities into quantities. And once the quantities are there, we have problems, and this is what Alain has stressed. We have problems to imagine that the origin behind a number is a qualitative agreement and a convention, and not a metric which is comparable to metrics in physical sciences. The historical context is the emergence of modern statistics from the 17th to the 19th century. As we say in statistics, the word statistics is closely related to the word state. So the statistics were born, or at least official statistics were born together with the nation state in the period of the Enlightenment. And the key terms that Alain has introduced for the sociology of quantification is the word or the term convention, that quantification is based on social agreements. For example, the definition of poverty or unemployment. Power, the question who defines what is measured and how it is measured. And as I already have explained, a kind of illusion that this objectivity, which comes with quantitative numbers, is something comparable to a physics or natural science precision. A second book or article which is important for the sociology of quantification is this of Espeland and Stevens. And they have compared, interestingly, the making of numbers with language. And they say language, statistics, in principle can be directly seen in a comparability with the features of language. Statistics is a language to talk about reality. And in this respect, they have highlighted 5 dimensions which are important, coming also from language, which is, the first one is work. Quantification requires significant labor infrastructure and coordination, which sometimes leads to bureaucratic procedures. Reactivity, numbers change what they measure, so they are not neutral. Discipline, quantification enables surveillance and control, allows really to steer systems, societies, companies, and so forth. And with that comes authorities. Numbers bear some kind of authority, and this authority depends ultimately on social trust and institutional power. And then, of course, there is the question of aesthetics. The aesthetics sometimes convince us because a graph or a chart comes with an aesthetic that in itself is convincing for us. Now, if we go to statistics, in particular public statistics, it is important that we distinguish different process steps in the generation of knowledge from the origin of data or the design of data. At 12 o'clock of this very simplified and standardized diagram, we see the design process, design of products, programs, methodology. At 3 o'clock, we see then what is produced in the statistical factories, production lines and systems. At 6 o'clock, we see communication and dissemination. So after the process has been stopped, there is not yet the end of the entire knowledge generation. But good communication also is absolutely crucial. And then at 9 o'clock of this circle, we see the use for knowledge creation and decision making. Now, in all these process steps, we have different traps and weaknesses. In the first one, in this design process, I think we can spot the danger that the whole society, with this dependence on numbers, develops into a direction of an audit society. We have populism and conspiration theories which lead to a kind of misuse of data and numbers. Finally, possibly then leading to an authoritarian state. The design itself can be inadequate. We can have wrong coding. We can have a design which is not neutral and jeopardized by mission. Or we can have a design which suffers from pressure on professional statisticians or on managers. So that finally the entire design of a statistical procedure is not leading to a high quality product. In the production itself, we can have, of course, errors, mistakes, and incorrect implementations. And finally, we could have miscommunication and insufficient literature, data literature and statistical literature, which then leads to a low data culture. So even if the design is good, there is an error-free production of statistics, then the phases of communication, they can lead to traps in miscommunication and misuse and abuse of statistics. This leads then to two dimensions. The first dimension is the what, which reality should be qualified, and I will come back to the later, is the how. But let's first talk about the what. And of course, when we talk about bigger statistical factories, the what is the what of today, the what of the statistical request for tomorrow, and maybe we have even to think about the statistical demand for the day after tomorrow, which means in a couple of years. And from this perspective, we have to ask ourselves, what are the products which will be requested from the society in 2 years from now or in 10 years from now? Of course, nobody knows, but there are sources which could give us a kind of impulse and some information in which direction we should look. And the first one is the annual global risk report of the World Economic Forum. I have here used the most recent one from January 2026, and it shows us that the short-term risks which are being assessed by the economic and political leaders which were then asked in the survey of the World Economic Forum, they see for the next 2 years geo-economic confrontations, for example, as the most important risk. So we could go down the different types of risks. The red risks are social polarization, the green risks are environmental ones, and the violet risks are data and cyber and digital risks. The picture is changing when we ask these leaders for their risk assessment over 10 years. And over 10 years, we see that then the green risks, which are then the environmental ones like climate change and biodiversity, they are being assessed as more important and more pressing than in a period 2 years from now. This corresponds with the so-called planetary boundaries. This is a graph from the Stockholm Resilience Institute, which gives us an impression for which planetary boundaries, these are environmental risk zones, we can, from a scientific viewpoint, today say that the globe, the Earth, already has passed specific thresholds so that the danger is increasing. And these planetary boundaries have developed over the last years in a quite dramatic way. And they could give us a projection where we will be in 2 years from now or even later. Lastly, we can draw also information about the future statistical program from the agreement of the United Nations, which is called the Program 2030. And this Program 2030 has the title Sustainable Development. And there we can see 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, from number 1, poverty, over many others, down to 14, life in water, and 15, life on Earth. All these goals are underpinned with target values and indicators, and it seems to be, let's say, a good assumption that we say the whole entire world will develop in this direction, which means also statistical programs and requests for good data will follow. The second question is how we quantify this reality. And this brings us then to conventions in public statistics. And conventions are typically the standards which are used in public statistics, and there are a whole lot of these standards. And the standards, more or less, then they are the middle zone in our process diagram, because on the left side we have the users and their sphere, where they translate information into decisions and knowledge. And on the right side at 3 o'clock we have the pure sphere for the producers, so the factories. But in the middle there is a kind of shared sphere where the producers and the users come together for the design of statistics and the good communication. So they share also responsibility that this is done in the best way possible. What kind of conventions do we have which are important in the factory statistics? If we start again with the design of products and programs, then it's the program itself which is already a convention, because it says, well, from our catalog of statistical products, so many percentage of the total budget go in this direction and so many percent go in another direction, and a couple of statistical features are not possible to be produced at all because they are no priority. So it's what a statistical service is producing should mirror in the best way possible the priorities of data demands from society. We have a lot of also standards for quality management in the European Union, for example, the European Statistics Code of Practice. This leads then to the production lines and systems of statistics. For communication, we have standards for the access to results, the timing of access to results, the microdata access. This is the access to confidential data for research. They are in principle very strictly limited, but under standardized and even legal conditions, such access is partly possible. Finally, of course, we have confidentiality standards like the data protection regulation of the EU. Finally, I would like to hint to some data manifestos, or to one data manifesto, which is the data manifesto of the UK Royal Statistical Society, which was designed by or issued by the Royal Statistical Society in the year 2019. And this is already 6 or even 7 years ago. At that time, it was said that data is a driver of prosperity, the revolutionary resource that is transforming the nature of economic activity, the capability that differentiates successful form from unsuccessful societies. This is not the entire data manifesto, but one can then see the different chapters of this data manifesto are more detailed and give recommendations in which direction societies should develop their handling of data. Now, as I said, this is already 6 or 7 years old. One can ask, what is the current status? And from the same society, namely the Royal Statistical Society, there is something new which came. And this is the vision for the future statistician. What should be the priority areas for, let's say, a good professional statistical behavior and literacy? And there are a couple of priority areas which are elaborated here for the training and education of the future generation of statisticians. For example, equip statisticians for technological change, clarify professional identity and skills, support career programming and learning, progression and learning, and so forth. So it is a kind of structure for the education of future statisticians, data scientists, or maybe even people from other disciplines like economics or medicine. And I think this is very urgent, and I would agree with the Royal Statistical Society that we should invest in the future statistician. Last but not least, this is an outlook from today to tomorrow from Georges Simon Ulrich. He is the Director General of the Swiss Statistical Office, and he has summarized 5 key takeaways for the situation where statistics meet on AI. And what he says is AI is changing how knowledge is produced and consumed. And this is a very important message, because it's not only the technological changes of our procedures, but it is the behavior, how people approach statistics and indicators, how they use it, and with which kind of questions they will address and come to statistical services in the future. He emphasizes that AI needs an epistemic backbone. Epistemic means ethical, qualitative, and so forth. And he sees the role of statistical offices to provide this backbone. The message that he is sending is that this cannot be built by a single institution alone. We need cooperation at national level, but in particular at a global or international level. And lastly, he talks about power. And this is the end of this first video. Power must remain distributed and democratically governed. So even if the world is changing quite rapidly with new demands, new habits, new data, new technologies, ethics and governance remain important, or they will be even more important by